In 1980, a geologist named Walter Alvarez was examining a thin band of clay in the mountains of Italy, a layer barely a centimeter thick, sandwiched between millions of years of ordinary limestone. When he and his father, the physicist Luis Alvarez, tested that clay, they found something that should not have been there. Iridium, a metal so rare on Earth's surface that it almost never shows up in measurable quantities. Sitting in that thin layer at levels 30 times higher than anywhere else in the surrounding rock. Iridium is common in asteroids. It is almost absent from our planet's crust. That single thin band of clay turned out to be the buried fingerprint of the asteroid that ended the age of the dinosaurs, 66 million years later, still readable, still chemically unmistakable, sitting quietly in a hillside in Italy. That discovery did something to the scientific imagination that has never fully settled back down. If one catastrophic afternoon, 66 million years ago, could leave behind a signature this clear, this durable, this unmistakable, then a question follows that most people have never thought to ask. What would an entire civilization leave behind? Not an asteroid, not a single afternoon, a civilization. Years of mining, burning, building, and consuming. If a single impact writes a sentence into the rock that lasts 66 million years, what would an industrial society write? And here is the genuinely unsettling part of that question, the part we are going to spend this entire video walking through carefully, piece by piece, the real science and the wild speculation kept honestly separate the whole way through. We have absolutely no idea what the answer is, and neither, it turns out, does anyone else, because nobody has ever actually had to look. This is not a fringe question dreamed up by conspiracy forums. In 2018, a NASA climate scientist named Gavin Schmidt and an astrophysicist named Adam Frank published a serious, peer-reviewed paper asking exactly this. They were not claiming a prior civilization existed, they were asking something far more interesting and far more rigorous. If one had, would we even be able to tell? Tonight, we are going to walk through what they found, what real anomalies already sitting in Earth's geological record have made some scientists genuinely pause, what an actual 2-billion-year-old natural nuclear reactor buried in West Africa can teach us about how easily nature can fake the signature of technology, and what the wildest claims about ancient civilizations, the buried cities, the impossible artifacts, the structures under the ice, actually turn out to be once a geologist looks closely. Some of it holds up to scrutiny far better than you'd expect. Most of it does not. We are going to tell you which is which, honestly, the entire way through. Stay with us until the end, because the most genuinely strange part of this story is not any single artifact. It is a mathematical fact about deep time itself, one that should change how you think about every single thing you assume you'd be able to find if you went looking. If this is the kind of question that gets under your skin in a good way, subscribe to Sky Ruins, because we dig into exactly this kind of evidence, the real geology behind the strange questions, on this channel regularly, and we are not finished with this particular thread. Drop a comment and tell us which piece of evidence in tonight's video surprises you most, the real one or the fake one, because by the end, you may find the line between them is not where you expected it to be. Let's get into it. Part 1. The question a NASA scientist actually asked. Here is the scale problem first, because almost nothing about this topic makes sense until you understand exactly how much time we are talking about, and almost nobody, including most people who make videos about this topic, actually sits with the number long enough to feel its weight. Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. Human civilization, counting generously from the first cities and the first writing, is somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years old. Do the division, and human civilization represents roughly 0.2 of Earth's total history. If you compress the entire age of the Earth down into a single 24-hour day, all of human civilization, the pyramids, the Roman Empire, the printing press, 2 world wars, the moon landing, and everything happening in this video right now, would occupy roughly the final fifth of a second before midnight. Everything else, the dinosaurs, the rise of complex life, the formation of the continents, the entire 4.5 billion years of everything else that ever happened on this planet, fills the other 23 hours, 59 minutes, and 59.8 seconds. Now ask the question Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank actually asked in their 2018 paper, published in the International Journal of Astrobiology under the title The Silurian Hypothesis: Would it be possible to detect an industrial civilization in the geological record? The name is a small, deliberate joke, borrowed from a British science fiction series featuring an intelligent reptilian species that supposedly predates humanity on Earth. But the paper itself is not science fiction. It is a serious methodological exercise by two working scientists, one of them the director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, asking a question that turns out to be much harder to answer than it first sounds. If an industrial civilization, comparable to ours, had existed and collapsed millions of years before humans evolved, what evidence would it actually leave behind? And would that evidence still be there, in a form we could recognize, today? This is not the same question as asking whether such a civilization actually existed. Schmidt and Frank are explicit about this in their own paper, and it is worth repeating clearly here, because most of the videos and articles that have picked up this topic since 2018 blur this distinction badly. They are not claiming evidence exists, they are asking a narrower, more useful question. Given what we know about how geology preserves and destroys information over millions of years, what is the theoretical detection threshold? How big, how widespread, how chemically distinctive would a civilization's footprint have to be in order to survive tens of millions of years of erosion, burial, and tectonic recycling, and still be distinguishable today from ordinary natural processes? Their starting point is the one piece of data we actually have, ourselves. Human civilization, in the space of roughly 2 centuries of industrial activity, has already changed the chemistry of the entire planet in ways that are going to be detectable for an extraordinarily long time. We have shifted the isotopic ratio of carbon in the atmosphere because the fossil fuels we burn come from organic material that has been locked away for hundreds of millions of years and carries a distinctive carbon signature different from the carbon currently cycling through the atmosphere and oceans. We have scattered plastic particles into every ocean basin on the planet, including the deepest trenches and the most remote Arctic ice. We have created radioactive isotopes, plutonium most notably, that essentially do not exist anywhere in nature and that were produced for the first time in human history during the nuclear weapons testing of the 1940s through the 1960s. We have driven a wave of species extinction, sharp and broad enough to be visible as a clear discontinuity in the fossil record, the kind of biodiversity signature that, in the deep past, normally only shows up in association with asteroid impacts or massive volcanic events. Put all of that together, and Schmidt and Frank conclude something that should genuinely unsettle you. A future geologist, examining Earth's rock layers 66 million years from now, with no prior knowledge that humans ever existed, would almost certainly be able to detect that something happened during our brief industrial period. They would see a thin, sharp, globally synchronized spike in carbon isotopes, a layer enriched with strange synthetic particles, a discontinuity in fossil diversity, and an unmistakable burst of isotopes that simply do not occur through any natural process. They might not know what caused it. They would absolutely know something did. This is the actual, careful, scientifically grounded version of the Silurian hypothesis, and it is genuinely interesting on its own terms, without a single invented detail. The honest answer the paper reaches is not, "We found evidence of ancient civilizations." The honest answer is our own activity proves that an industrial civilization leaves a chemically detectable mark on this planet for tens of millions of years at minimum, which means the right question to ask about Earth's deep past is not did a prior civilization exist, but have we ever actually looked for a signature like the one we know we are creating right now, in the rock layers old enough that one could theoretically be hiding? That question turns out to have a far more complicated answer than you might expect, because it leads directly into one of the strangest, best documented, and most genuinely misunderstood discoveries in the entire history of nuclear physics. One that already, decades ago, forced scientists to confront exactly the problem Schmidt and Frank's paper describes. How do you tell the difference between something nature did on its own and something that looks, on first inspection, unmistakably artificial. Part 2. The 2-billion-year-old nuclear reactor that nature built by accident. In May of 1972, technicians at a nuclear fuel processing plant in Pierrelat, France, were running a routine quality check on a shipment of uranium ore that had arrived from a mine at Oklo, in the West African nation of Gabon. Every batch of natural uranium ore on Earth carries an extremely consistent, well-known ratio of two isotopes, uranium-235 and uranium-238, a ratio so stable and so universal that French regulators used it as a standard reference point for verifying nuclear material had not been diverted for unauthorized purposes. The Oklo ore failed the check. Its uranium-235 content was measurably lower than it should have been, lower than every other sample of natural uranium ore ever measured, anywhere on Earth, before or since. For a brief, genuinely tense moment, this was treated as a serious nuclear security concern, since the most obvious explanation for uranium-235 going missing from a sample is that someone has already extracted it, the exact process used to make nuclear reactor fuel and nuclear weapons. French scientists traveled to the mine, took fresh samples directly from the ore body itself, far from any possible human tampering, and got the same anomalous result. The uranium-235 simply was not there in the expected quantity. Something had already consumed it, in place, inside the rock, before anyone had ever mined it. What they eventually proved, through careful isotopic analysis of the surrounding rock, remains one of the single strangest confirmed facts in all of geology. Roughly 1.7 to 2 billion years ago, in that specific deposit at Oklo, the natural concentration of uranium ore, combined with a very particular set of geological conditions, had spontaneously achieved nuclear fission. Not once, not as a brief accident, but as a sustained, self-regulating chain reaction that operated, in cycles, for an estimated several 100,000 years. Nature, with no design, no intention, and no intelligence whatsoever, had built a working nuclear reactor. Here is the mechanism, and it matters because it is the perfect illustration of exactly the problem this entire video is built around. Uranium-235 is the isotope capable of sustaining a fission chain reaction, but it makes up less than 1% of natural uranium today, far too dilute to sustain a reaction without artificial enrichment, the energy-intensive industrial process modern nuclear programs use to concentrate it. But uranium-235 decays faster than its far more common cousin, uranium-238. Run the decay math backward 2 billion years, and the natural concentration of uranium-235 in any uranium ore on Earth would have been around 3%, which happens to be almost exactly the enrichment level used in many modern commercial nuclear reactors. At Oklo, geological processes had concentrated uranium ore into rich veins, and at that specific point in Earth's history, naturally occurring groundwater seeping through those veins was able to do something water cannot do with today's depleted, lower concentration uranium. It acted as what nuclear engineers call a moderator, slowing neutrons down to exactly the speed needed to sustain a fission chain reaction. The same basic function performed by the engineered cooling and moderating systems inside a deliberately built nuclear power plant. The reaction was self-regulating in a way that should genuinely impress you. As fission proceeded, it heated the surrounding rock and groundwater. The water boiled away or was driven off as steam. Without the water acting as a moderator, the chain reaction stalled. The rock cooled, groundwater seeped back in. The reaction restarted. Geologists studying the site have reconstructed a natural duty cycle, the reactor running for perhaps 30 minutes at a time, then sitting dormant for roughly 2.5 hours, over and over, for hundreds of thousands of years, an entirely unintentional, entirely natural nuclear power plant regulating its own output through nothing more than the physical properties of water and rock. Why does this matter for tonight's video specifically? Because the Oklo reactor produces exactly the kind of signature that, if you found it without context, without understanding the specific and unusual geological conditions required to produce it naturally, you would have every reason to assume was proof of deliberate, intelligent, technological activity. The site contains depleted uranium. It contains a distinct suite of fission byproducts, the same general category of radioactive decay products produced by an artificial reactor, locked into the surrounding rock, in patterns that required real, careful nuclear physics to properly interpret. If a geologist in 1972 had simply found the depleted uranium signature without doing the deeper isotopic work, missing isotope by missing isotope, water table by water table, the conclusion someone might have jumped to, someone less careful, someone working from a different set of assumptions, is exactly the conclusion several genuinely popular pieces of pseudoscience over the following decades did jump to, that Oklo was proof of an ancient artificial reactor built by some prior civilization, evidence that nuclear technology existed on Earth 2 billion years before humans. That is not what Oklo is. It is something almost more remarkable, proof that nature, under the right specific and rare conditions, can spontaneously produce a process indistinguishable in its basic physical signature from deliberate nuclear engineering, with absolutely no intelligence involved at any point. And it stands today as the single best real-world case study for the exact methodological problem at the heart of the Silurian hypothesis. Finding a signature that looks artificial is not the same as proving it is artificial. The actual scientific work, the careful, patient, often unglamorous work of isotope by isotope analysis, is what separates a real discovery like Oklo from a sloppy, premature conclusion. The scientists who solved Oklo did not get to skip that work. Neither does anyone making a claim about ancient civilizations today, however exciting the initial signature looks. Keep Oklo firmly in mind as we go forward tonight, because it is going to come up again, directly, when we get to the specific anomalies, the spheres, the artifacts, the structures, that people online cite as evidence of lost civilizations. Some of those claims have already been investigated, with the same rigor that solved Oklo. Most of them, once you look closely, turn out to dissolve in exactly the way you would hope careful science dissolves a false lead. But first, we need to talk about what real, working scientists, not internet theorists, have actually found when they have gone looking seriously for civilization-scale chemical signatures in the deep past, because the honest answer is more interesting and considerably more unsettling than most people expect. Part 3. The 56-million-year-old event that looks disturbingly like us. If you wanted to find a real, documented, scientifically established event in Earth's deep past that produces almost exactly the chemical signature an ancient industrial civilization would theoretically leave behind, you do not need to invent one. It already exists, it is thoroughly studied, and it is the single example Schmidt and Frank lean on most heavily in their own paper as the closest natural analogue available for comparison. It is called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, and it happened approximately 56 million years ago. Over a geologically brief window, somewhere on the order of a few thousand to 20,000 years, depending on which sediment core you examine, global average temperatures spiked by somewhere between 5 and 8 degrees Celsius. Ocean chemistry shifted sharply toward acidification. A massive pulse of carbon, somewhere in the range of several thousand gigatons, entered the atmosphere and oceans. And crucially, that carbon carried a distinctive isotopic signature, a depleted ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 that closely resembles the isotopic fingerprint produced when ancient, long-buried organic carbon, the same kind of carbon locked up in coal, oil, and natural gas, gets released rapidly into the active carbon cycle. That is, by no coincidence at all, almost exactly the same carbon isotope signature scientists already use to track and document the human-caused carbon emissions of the past 2 centuries. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum looks, on a sediment core, disturbingly similar to a vastly larger, vastly older version of the rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide we have produced since the Industrial Revolution. Mainstream geology has a well-supported, non-civilizational explanation for what caused it, most likely a combination of intense volcanic activity associated with the North Atlantic igneous province, possibly amplified by the rapid release of methane that had been frozen in seafloor deposits, destabilized as ocean temperatures initially warmed and triggering a feedback loop that accelerated the warming further. Nobody studying the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum seriously argues it was caused by an ancient civilization burning fossil fuels. The geological evidence for large-scale volcanism during that exact window is solid, independently verified, and sufficient on its own to explain the carbon release without needing to invoke anything else. But here is why Schmidt and Frank specifically highlight this event in their paper, and it is the single most important methodological point in this entire video, the one worth holding onto through everything that follows. If a genuine ancient industrial civilization had existed and released carbon into the atmosphere at an industrial pace, the geological signature it would leave behind would look, in the basic, broad strokes that an isotope analysis can actually detect, very similar to the signature the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum already shows us a purely natural process is fully capable of producing on its own. This is not a comforting fact for anyone hoping to find clean, obvious proof of a lost civilization. It is the opposite. It means the most basic, most repeatable category of evidence, a sharp spike in light carbon isotopes, is already known to be producible by natural geological processes operating with zero biological or technological involvement whatsoever. Which means that even if an ancient civilization's carbon signature were sitting in the rock record right now, in a layer somewhere we have already drilled, cored, and sampled, the default, statistically reasonable, scientifically responsible conclusion drawn from that signature alone would correctly point toward volcanism or methane release first, every time, because those are common, well understood, and abundantly evidenced processes, while an ancient civilization is none of those things. This is the genuine, uncomfortable core of the detection problem, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than glossed over. It is not that geologists are closed-minded or unwilling to consider the idea. It is that the most basic chemical signature an ancient civilization would leave is, on its own, ambiguous. It requires additional, corroborating evidence, multiple independent lines pointing the same direction at once, to distinguish a civilizational signature from a volcanic one. And so far, in the actual published scientific literature, examining the actual cores drilled from the actual ocean floor and actual ice sheets, that additional corroborating evidence has never been found. Not because nobody has looked. Geologists drill thousands of cores every year for entirely unrelated reasons: climate reconstruction, oil exploration, basic stratigraphy, and every single one of those cores is, in effect, an opportunity for an anomalous civilizational signature to show up. None has. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum has a volcanic explanation that fits every available data point. So does every other major carbon isotope excursion in the geological record that has been seriously studied. This is not proof that no prior civilization ever existed. It is, however, a meaningful and honest piece of negative evidence, the kind any fair accounting of this topic has to take seriously rather than waving away. There is a second category of evidence worth understanding clearly before we move into the specific artifacts and structures that get cited online, because it follows the exact same logic, and it is, in some ways, even more important: mass extinction events. We know mass extinctions happen. We can date them precisely using the same isotope and sediment techniques used everywhere else in this video. And every major mass extinction event that has been seriously investigated has a well-supported natural cause: an asteroid impact for the most famous one, 66 million years ago, the same one whose iridium signature opened tonight's video, and massive, sustained volcanism for several of the others, including the Permian-Triassic extinction 252 million years ago, often called the Great Dying, which eliminated somewhere around 90 to 96% of marine species and roughly 70% of land vertebrates over a relatively short geological window tied to the eruption of the Siberian Traps, one of the largest volcanic events in the planet's entire history. These extinctions are sometimes cited online as possible evidence of ancient warfare, deliberate biological weapons, or some other civilizational catastrophe, on the basic logic that something killed off the vast majority of life on Earth and that something must have been deliberate. The actual geological evidence does not support that leap, and it is worth being honest about exactly why. The Siberian Traps eruptions left behind a vast, continuous, multi-million square kilometer layer of solidified lava, basalt flows you can stand on and measure directly today across a huge swath of Siberia, dated with multiple independent radiometric techniques to precisely the same several thousand-year window as the extinction event itself. The chemistry of the extinction, a global temperature spike, severe ocean acidification, a collapse in oxygen levels in the oceans, lines up exactly with what massive, sustained volcanic outgassing would be expected to produce, with no gap in the evidence requiring an alternative explanation. The honest scientific picture is not previous civilization unfalsifiable mystery. It is here is a well-documented natural disaster, here is the rock that proves it happened, here is the chemistry that proves how, and no additional explanation is currently required by the available evidence. So where does that leave the actual search for ancient civilizations? It leaves us exactly where Schmidt and Frank's paper leaves us, with a real, serious, scientifically grounded framework for what we would need to find, and an honest accounting of the fact that, so far, every time we have looked closely at a signature that superficially resembles what that framework predicts, a thoroughly mundane, thoroughly natural explanation has been sitting right there, supported by independent evidence, every single time. That is not a satisfying answer if you wanted this video to end with proof. It is, however, the actual state of the science, and it sets up exactly the right context for what comes next, because it is also exactly the moment where a great deal of online content about this topic quietly stops doing real science and starts doing something else entirely. Part 4. The artifacts people actually point to. Let's talk about the specific objects, because if you have spent any time at all in this corner of the internet, you have seen them. Strange spheres found in ancient rock, metal objects supposedly pulled from inside lumps of coal, a hammerhead fused into solid stone. These show up constantly, in videos, in forum posts, in breathless articles, presented as smoking guns. Some of them are genuinely strange-looking. None of them, once you apply the same careful isotope-by-isotope rigor that solved the Oklo mystery, hold up as evidence of an ancient civilization. Walking through exactly why is the most useful thing this video can do for you, because it teaches you how to evaluate the next one of these that crosses your feed. Start with the Klerksdorp spheres, probably the single most circulated example in this entire genre. These are small, hard, roughly spherical objects, ranging from about half an inch to a few inches across, pulled out of pyrophyllite deposits near Ottersdal, South Africa, in rock dated to roughly 3 billion years old. Online, they are routinely described as perfectly machined metal balls, complete with precisely engraved parallel grooves running around their equator, the kind of finish that supposedly could only come from a lathe or some other precision tool, found in rock laid down 1 billion years before the earliest known multicellular life. That description, the one that travels fastest online, is simply not accurate. Geologists who have actually examined these objects, cutting them open and analyzing their internal structure, rather than just photographing the outside, have identified them as a well-understood and entirely natural type of object called a concretion, specifically composed of the mineral wollastonite along with hematite, formed through a completely ordinary geological process where mineral-rich groundwater precipitates layer upon layer of material around a small nucleus. The same basic process, just with different minerals involved, that produces the rounded stones called Moki marbles in the American Southwest, or the so-called Carboniferous concretions found scattered through coal seams worldwide. The grooves that get described as precision machined are consistent with natural growth banding and differential weathering along layers of varying hardness, the same mechanism that produces banding patterns in countless other mineral formations that nobody mistakes for technology. Pyrophyllite itself, the rock these objects come from, is also significantly softer than the spheres themselves, meaning that as the surrounding rock erodes away faster than the harder concretions embedded within it, you end up with these objects sitting loose and exposed, looking for all the world like they were placed there deliberately, when in fact, what you are looking at is simply the harder material that survived while everything softer around it wore away. Then there is the so-called London hammer, sometimes called the Ordovician hammer, a genuinely real object, a corroded iron hammerhead with a partially preserved wooden handle, encased in a chunk of rock found near London, Texas, in the 1930s. Online, this gets presented as proof of an impossibly ancient technological civilization, because the surrounding rock has sometimes been claimed to be hundreds of millions of years old, supposedly from the Ordovician period, more than 400 million years before any tool-using species existed. Here is what a closer geological look actually reveals. The hammer itself is a recognizable, ordinary 19th or early 20th century mining tool design, not some exotic, unidentifiable alloy. The encasing rock is not bedrock at all. It is a concretion, the same general category of object as the Klerksdorp spheres, formed when minerals dissolved in groundwater, often calcium carbonate, precipitate out and harden around an object that is sitting in or near sediment, a process that, under the right conditions, particularly in mineral-rich water, can happen within decades rather than millions of years. There is no independent dating of the surrounding nodule that supports an Ordovician age, and there is no scientific publication, no peer-reviewed analysis behind the headline claim. What you actually have is a real, physical object whose strangeness comes entirely from a popularized, undocumented claim about its age, a claim that has never been substantiated by anyone using the kind of careful radiometric or stratigraphic dating that, for example, pinned down the Oklo reactor's age to within a tight, independently verified range. The coal artifact stories, the chains, bells, and carved stones miners reportedly found embedded inside lumps of coal mostly during the 19th and early 20th centuries, follow a related pattern, but with an even thinner evidentiary trail. Almost none of the original specimens described in these stories survive today for modern analysis. The accounts come from newspaper reports and second-hand retellings, frequently decades after the supposed discovery, almost never accompanied by detailed documentation of exactly where in a mine the object was found, who found it, or under what conditions. Coal mining in this era was a chaotic, physically demanding industrial process, and the opportunities for an object to be accidentally introduced into a coal seam, dropped by a miner, embedded during blasting, mixed in during transport and processing, are numerous and mundane. Extraordinary claims of this kind require extraordinary documentation, and what survives instead is, almost without exception, an extraordinary story with ordinary documentation, which is exactly the kind of evidentiary gap that, fairly, keeps these stories in the category of folklore rather than science. One more example worth a brief mention, because it follows yet another distinct and instructive pattern, the Ica stones. Thousands of carved andesite stones collected in Peru beginning in the 1960s, depicting what some claimed were dinosaurs alongside humans, surgical procedures, and astronomical instruments, presented by a local physician named Javier Cabrera as proof of an ancient, scientifically advanced culture with direct knowledge of creatures that supposedly went extinct tens of millions of years earlier. This case differs from the others in a genuinely useful way, because it was not left as an open question. A local farmer and stonecutter named Basilio Ushuya, who had supplied many of the stones, publicly admitted and demonstrated on camera for journalists that he and others had carved them using modern tools, copying images from comic books, magazines, and other contemporary sources, occasionally aging the stones artificially by burying them in animal dung for a period before selling them. This is the rare case in this entire genre where the manufacturing process behind a claimed ancient artifact was directly confessed and demonstrated by the person who made it, and it is worth holding on to specifically because it shows that the impulse to manufacture this exact kind of evidence is not a hypothetical risk. It has actually happened, repeatedly, and people have been caught doing it. Here is the pattern worth noticing across every one of these specific cases, because it is the same pattern every single time. The story travels fastest in its most dramatic, least qualified form, perfectly machined, impossibly ancient, scientifically inexplicable. The actual geological investigation, when it happens at all, is slower, less dramatic, and almost always available publicly if you go looking for it. and it almost always lands on a mundane, well-understood natural or historical process. This does not mean every strange object ever found has a tidy explanation waiting to be discovered, and it would be its own kind of overclaiming to say that with total certainty. It means that the specific, most widely circulated examples used to support claims of ancient lost civilizations have, every single time someone has actually done the careful work, turned out not to hold up. That is a meaningfully different and more honest statement than either everything is fake or this proves something real is going on, and it is the statement the actual evidence currently supports. There is, however, one category of evidence in this entire conversation that genuinely does not fit neatly into either of those boxes, a real scientific hypothesis, still actively debated inside mainstream geology and archaeology, involving an actual chemical anomaly found in sediment layers around the world, dated to almost exactly the time human civilization itself was first beginning to take shape. Unlike the spheres and the hammer, this one has real published, peer-reviewed research behind it, real ongoing scientific argument on both sides, and it sits at the exact center of the most popular and most controversial lost civilization claims being made in mainstream media today. Part 5. The one genuine scientific argument in this entire topic. Around 12,900 years ago, give or take a century or two depending on which dating method you trust most, something happened to Earth's climate that remains, even among mainstream climate scientists with no interest whatsoever in ancient civilizations, a genuinely difficult event to fully explain. The planet had been steadily warming out of the last glacial period, ice sheets retreating, temperatures climbing in a roughly predictable curve. Then, over what ice core records suggest may have been as little as a few decades, possibly less, the northern hemisphere plunged back into near-glacial cold, a sudden, sharp reversal that lasted for well over 1,000 years before warming resumed. This abrupt cold interval is called the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic wildflower whose pollen shows up suddenly and abundantly in European lake sediments from exactly this period, a flower that thrives in cold tundra conditions and essentially vanishes from the record once the climate warmed again. The mainstream explanation for decades has centered on changes in ocean circulation, specifically a disruption to the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the same general ocean current system that helps keep modern Western Europe considerably warmer than its latitude would otherwise suggest, likely triggered by a massive pulse of fresh meltwater from collapsing North American ice sheets disrupting the normal flow of salty, dense water that drives that circulation. This remains the dominant, most widely supported explanation, and it has solid physical oceanography behind it. But in 2007, a research team led by Richard Firestone proposed an additional, genuinely startling alternative, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most respected peer-reviewed scientific journals in the world. They argued that the onset of the Younger Dryas coincides, within the resolution of available dating, with evidence of an extraterrestrial impact event, not necessarily a single large crater-forming asteroid, but possibly the fragmented airburst of a comet, similar in basic mechanism to the much smaller 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, but vastly larger in scale, occurring over North America and possibly other regions simultaneously. Their evidence, and this is the part worth understanding carefully, because it uses exactly the same methodology as the Alvarez iridium discovery that opened this video, includes a thin sediment layer found at multiple sites across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, containing elevated platinum concentrations, the same general category of rare, extraterrestrial associated element as iridium, along with microscopic spherules of melted, glass-like material called impact spherules, and nanodiamonds, exotic forms of carbon that on Earth typically only form under the extreme pressure and temperature conditions associated with impact events. This is not a fringe claim invented for a documentary. It is a real, published, peer-reviewed scientific hypothesis that has been argued over in serious academic journals for nearly 2 decades now. And the honest thing to tell you the thing most popular coverage of this topic skips entirely in one direction or the other is that the scientific community remains genuinely, substantively divided on it. Multiple research teams have published papers supporting various pieces of the impact evidence: additional platinum anomalies, additional nanodiamond finds, additional impact spheral layers at new sites across multiple continents. Multiple other research teams attempting to replicate specific findings have failed to find the same signatures at some of the original sites, have raised serious questions about whether some of the claimed nanodiamonds are actually nanodiamonds at all, rather than a different, more common carbon structure, and have argued that the platinum anomaly, while real, could plausibly be explained by other processes, including ordinary volcanic activity or even contamination during sample processing. As of right now, there is no full scientific consensus either confirming or rejecting the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It remains, genuinely, an open, actively contested question, with serious researchers and serious published evidence on both sides of it, which is a meaningfully different scientific status than essentially every other piece of evidence we have discussed in this video so far. Here is where the genuinely careful, honest version of this conversation has to draw a sharp, clear line, because this is exactly the point where a real scientific controversy gets quietly used to support a much larger, much less supported claim. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, even in its strongest, most favorable form, even if every contested piece of evidence turns out to hold up under further scrutiny, is a hypothesis about climate disruption from an extraterrestrial impact event. It is not, on its own, evidence of an advanced lost civilization. That additional claim, popularized most prominently by the writer Graham Hancock, particularly in his Netflix series and in his earlier books, argues that an advanced global civilization existed before this event, possibly with knowledge and technology comparable to or exceeding the ancient societies we know about historically, and that this civilization was wiped out by the very impact event Firestone's team described, with isolated survivors going on to seed the much later, much more familiar early civilizations of the Fertile Crescent and elsewhere, with fragments of lost advanced knowledge. The archaeological evidence for that specific additional claim, the advanced global civilization part, separate from the climate impact part, is essentially absent, and this is worth being precise about why. Archaeologists working on this exact time period, roughly 13,000 to 11,000 years ago, have extensively excavated sites across the regions where this advanced civilization is claimed to have existed, and what they find consistently is evidence entirely consistent with mobile or semi-settled hunter-gatherer societies, sophisticated in their own context, genuinely impressive in adapting to a rapidly changing climate, but showing no evidence of the writing systems, monumental architecture, metallurgy, or other markers of complex urban civilization that show up clearly and unambiguously several thousand years later. The site most frequently cited in support of the advanced lost civilization claim, Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, is genuinely remarkable, predating Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years and showing organized, large-scale construction earlier than almost any other known site on Earth. But Göbekli Tepe's builders used stone tools, left no writing, and show no evidence of agriculture at the site's earliest phases. It is a real, important, and genuinely surprising archaeological discovery, one that has pushed back the timeline for organized large-scale human cooperation earlier than archaeologists previously assumed possible. It is not evidence of an advanced civilization with lost technology, and the archaeologists who actually excavated it, including the site's original lead researcher, have been consistently and publicly clear on that distinction, often specifically and directly pushing back against the popularized claims being built on top of their work. So here is the honest, complete picture of this single most contested piece of evidence in the entire lost civilization conversation. There is a real, ongoing, legitimate scientific debate about whether an extraterrestrial impact event contributed to the abrupt Younger Dryas cooling. There is no comparable scientific support, and a great deal of direct archaeological evidence against, the additional claim that this event destroyed an advanced, technologically sophisticated global civilization. Both of those statements are true at the same time, and the genuine intellectual sin committed by a significant amount of popular content on this topic is collapsing those two separate claims into one, borrowing the legitimate scientific uncertainty around the first to manufacture false credibility for the second, which has nowhere near the same evidentiary support. This pattern, a real anomaly serving as the seed for a much larger, much less supported claim, shows up again, in a different, and in some ways even stranger form, when we turn to the place most frequently cited as the hiding spot for whatever evidence supposedly remains, the 2 miles of ice sitting on top of an entire continent that very few people have ever actually had the chance to look beneath. Part 6. What is actually under the ice? Antarctica holds a unique, almost magnetic pull in this entire genre of speculation, and it is easy to understand why. It is the single largest landmass on Earth that remains, in any practical sense, unexplored at ground level, buried under an ice sheet that averages well over a mile thick and reaches nearly 3 miles deep in places. If you wanted to hide evidence of an ancient civilization somewhere on this planet, somewhere genuinely difficult for anyone to verify or refute with a simple visit, Antarctica is close to the perfect location, which is exactly why it shows up constantly in this conversation, usually accompanied by claims of pyramid-shaped structures spotted on satellite imagery, vast geometric patterns detected by ground-penetrating radar, or ancient maps that supposedly depict the continent's coastline before it was covered in ice. Let's start with what scientists have actually found, because it is genuinely fascinating without needing any embellishment at all. Antarctica's bedrock, the actual rock surface underneath all that ice, has been mapped in extraordinary and continuously improving detail over the past several decades, using ice-penetrating radar flown on aircraft crisscrossing the continent in carefully planned survey grids, supplemented by satellite gravity measurements and seismic data. The most comprehensive published compilation of this data, a project called Bed Machine Antarctica, reveals a landscape every bit as dramatic and varied as anything found on the ice-free continents. Mountain ranges, including peaks that rival the height of the Alps, buried entirely under ice and invisible from the surface. Vast canyons carved by ancient rivers when the continent was last ice-free, and more than 600 subglacial lakes, the largest of which, Lake Vostok, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario, sitting under more than 2 miles of ice, sealed off from the surface and from direct sunlight for what researchers estimate to be somewhere between several 100,000 and over 1 million years. These subglacial lakes are themselves one of the most genuinely exciting frontiers in modern Earth science, not because of any connection to lost civilizations, but because of an entirely different and, frankly, more remarkable question. What kind of life, if any, has survived for that long in complete darkness, under enormous pressure, cut off from the rest of the planet's biosphere? When Russian, British, and American research teams finally managed to sample water and sediment from beneath the ice at Lake Vostok and several other subglacial lakes over the past 2 decades, without contaminating these pristine, ancient environments in the process, they found evidence of microbial life adapted to exactly those extreme conditions, an entire category of biology essentially unknown anywhere else on Earth. That is the real frontier of Antarctic subsurface science right now, microbiology and extremophile biology, not archaeology, and it is arguably stranger and more scientifically significant than anything the lost civilization claims propose. Now to the actual viral claims, because they deserve a direct, specific answer rather than a vague dismissal. In 2016, a particular set of Google Earth satellite images began circulating widely, showing a roughly triangular, pyramid-like peak protruding from the ice near the Ellsworth Mountains, with breathless captions suggesting it was an artificial structure, evidence of an advanced civilization, possibly even connected to Atlantis. Glaciologists and geomorphologists who actually study mountain formation responded to this quickly and specifically, because the explanation requires no speculation at all. Pyramidal peaks are an extremely common, entirely natural landform wherever glaciocarved mountains from multiple sides simultaneously. The technical name for this landform is a glacial horn, and the most famous example on the entire planet, one that tourists photograph by the millions every year, with no confusion about its origin, is the Matterhorn in the Swiss Alps, a textbook glacial horn formed by exactly the same erosional process visible in the Antarctic image. When glacial ice carves into a mountain from 3 or 4 directions at once, cutting back steep-walled bowls called cirques on each face, what is left standing in the middle is geometrically, almost inevitably, a pyramid shape, sharp ridges meeting at a peak, simply because that is the natural result of multiple erosional surfaces intersecting. Antarctica, having been heavily glaciated for tens of millions of years, has produced numerous glacial horns across its exposed mountain ranges, and the one that went viral in 2016 has been specifically surveyed and confirmed by glaciologists to be one of these entirely natural formations, structurally and compositionally continuous with the surrounding bedrock, not a separate, distinct, artificial object placed on top of it. The claims about ground-penetrating radar detecting buried cities or geometric structures beneath the ice trace back primarily to a small number of unverified, non-peer-reviewed sources, frequently citing data that, when traced to its actual origin, turns out to be either badly misread normal subglacial topography, the kind of natural ridges and valleys bed machine Antarctica has mapped in legitimate detail, or in some documented cases, imagery and claims that cannot be traced to any verifiable survey at all. No peer-reviewed glaciology publication, and there have been a great many of them, using real radar data collected by real research aircraft over real survey transects, has ever reported a structure beneath the Antarctic ice that could not be explained by ordinary bedrock geology. This is also, worth noting directly, a case where the absence of a finding is not a function of nobody looking. Antarctic subglacial mapping is one of the most heavily funded, internationally collaborative, continuously updated geophysical survey programs on the planet, precisely because the bedrock topography underneath the ice matters enormously for understanding how the ice sheet itself will respond to a warming climate, which is a question with direct, practical, multi-billion-dollar consequences for coastal cities worldwide. The scientists doing this work have every incentive to report anything genuinely unusual they find, and considerable career benefit in doing so. They have reported mountains, canyons, lakes, and an extraordinarily detailed picture of how the ice sheet has evolved over millions of years. They have not reported pyramids, cities, or geometric structures inconsistent with natural geology. There is one more specific claim worth addressing directly before we move on, because it gets cited constantly in this same conversation. Old maps, most famously the Piri Reis map from 1513, supposedly showing Antarctica's coastline accurately mapped centuries before the continent was officially discovered in the early 1800s, taken as evidence that some prior, more advanced civilization surveyed and mapped the continent before it was covered in ice, with that knowledge somehow surviving to influence later cartography. Historians of cartography who have actually studied the Piri Reis map in detail, examining the Ottoman admiral's own marginal notes, which explicitly cite the sources he used, have traced its southern coastline to a reasonably straightforward combination of contemporary and earlier 16th century sources, including, by Piri Reis's own written annotation, maps connected to Christopher Columbus's voyages, depicting the South American coastline. The southern portion of the map that gets cited as Antarctica is generally understood by cartographic historians as a continuation, likely somewhat distorted and speculative in the way many early maps filled in unexplored regions, of the South American coast curving eastward, consistent with common map projection conventions and guesswork of that exact era, not a precise, otherwise inexplicable survey of a genuinely ice-free Antarctic coastline. So where that leaves Antarctica, honestly, is this. It is one of the most scientifically rich, actively studied, and genuinely strange places on the planet, full of real mysteries, ancient sealed lakes, exotic microbial life, mountain ranges no human eye has ever directly seen, and absolutely none of those real mysteries currently include evidence of a lost civilization. Which brings us, finally, to the deepest and most honest question underneath everything we have covered tonight. the one Schmidt and Frank's original paper was really asking all along, and the one that deserves a careful, complete answer before we close. Part 6.5. What would even count? Before we get to whether we could detect a prior civilization, there is a more basic question worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the entire shape of the search. What would actually count as one in the first place? Most people, asked to picture a civilization, picture something close to a skyline, cities, writing, governments, monuments, the kind of visible, durable, organized complexity that shows up clearly in a history textbook. But anthropologists and archaeologists who study this question professionally have always worked with a considerably broader, more careful definition. Because human societies themselves have varied enormously in which of these markers they actually display. Consider Çatalhöyük, a genuinely remarkable 9,000-year-old settlement in modern Turkey, one of the earliest large, dense human communities ever discovered. It had no streets in any recognizable sense, no monumental architecture, and almost certainly no writing. Its densely packed mud brick homes were built wall to wall, with no doors at all, accessed instead by ladders through openings in the roof. By the skyline standard, it would barely register. By the standard archaeologists actually use, sustained, organized, large-scale communal living, shared ritual practice, coordinated construction, evidence of long-distance trade in materials like obsidian, it is unambiguously a real significant step in the development of human complexity, and it is treated that way in the literature without controversy. Push this same logic further, and you arrive at one of the more genuinely humbling comparisons available anywhere in biology, one worth taking seriously rather than treating as a cute aside. A termite mound, the kind built by several species across Africa, Australia, and South America, can rise many feet above the ground, while extending an equally elaborate network of tunnels and chambers below it, engineered with a level of functional sophistication that genuinely impresses structural engineers who study it. The mound's architecture actively regulates internal temperature and humidity for the colony living inside, using a passive ventilation system, channels and chimneys oriented and shaped to harness wind and convection, that maintains remarkably stable internal conditions despite extreme swings in outside temperature, all without a single individual termite understanding, planning, or directing the overall design. The colony cultivates fungus gardens for food in some species, effectively practicing a form of agriculture. It allocates labor across distinct specialized roles. It defends territory, manages waste, and persists as a continuous, functioning society for decades, far longer than the lifespan of any individual insect within it. No biologist seriously argues that termite colonies represent civilization in any sense comparable to human societies, and that is an important distinction, not a contradiction of the point being made here. The relevant question is not whether termites are civilized, it is what happens to our confidence about detecting past intelligence once we admit that sophisticated, large-scale, coordinated engineering does not, on its own, require anything resembling human-style consciousness, language, or intention to produce. If complex, functional, environmentally responsive structure can emerge from a termite colony with zero individual awareness of the overall design, then the dividing line between an impressive natural structure and deliberate intelligent construction is genuinely blurrier than our instincts suggest, and a geologist examining an ancient, eroded, partially destroyed structure of unknown origin has to take that ambiguity seriously rather than assuming any sufficiently organized pattern must indicate human-style intelligence behind it, or, just as easily, assuming any sufficiently organized pattern must be purely natural. This is also exactly why the Schmidt and Frank paper deliberately avoids defining its search in terms of buildings, tools, or other directly recognizable human-style artifacts, and instead anchors its entire methodology in chemistry and isotope ratios. A skyline requires a society that builds the way we build, with the materials we use, for the reasons we build. A geochemical signature, a sudden, synchronized shift in atmospheric carbon, a burst of isotopes that do not occur naturally, a sharp discontinuity in global biodiversity, requires only that a civilization, whatever form its intelligence and its technology actually took, consumed enough energy and resources at a fast enough pace to leave a measurable mark on planetary-scale chemical cycles. That is a dramatically lower and more defensible bar than requiring a previous civilization to have built things that look like our things, and it is precisely why this entire video has spent so much more time on carbon isotopes and radioactive fallout than on hypothetical ancient cities. A civilization built from biodegradable materials, organized in ways we would not immediately recognize as urban, communicating in ways that leave no inscriptions behind, might still leave the one kind of trace that does not depend on matching our specific cultural template, a sufficiently large, sufficiently synchronized fingerprint in the planet's deep chemistry. Exactly the same category of evidence the Anthropocene debate shows our own civilization is leaving behind right now, whether or not anyone ever finds a single recognizable artifact alongside it. So that is the honest, expanded version of the actual search criteria, and it should reframe how you think about everything else in tonight's video. We are not looking for a lost skyline. We are looking for a chemical echo loud enough to rise above 4.5 billion years of ordinary planetary noise, and so far, in everywhere we have happened to look, that echo has not been there. Part 7. Could we even tell? Let's return to the actual question at the center of Schmidt and Frank's paper, because everything we have walked through so far, Oklo, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the Younger Dryas debate, Antarctica, has been building toward it, and it deserves a direct, careful answer rather than a shrug. Start with how poorly the fossil record actually preserves life, even recent, abundant, well-documented life, because this is the single most important piece of context for understanding why the absence of obvious evidence is not, on its own, strong evidence of absence. Fossilization requires a specific, fairly narrow set of conditions. An organism needs to be buried rapidly, ideally in fine sediment with low oxygen content, before scavengers, bacteria, and ordinary decay can break it down completely, and then that burial site needs to remain undisturbed by erosion, tectonic deformation, or excessive heat and pressure for the entire span of time, until, eventually, by chance, erosion or excavation exposes it again, in a location and at a moment when someone capable of recognizing it happens to be looking. Run the numbers on how many organisms have ever lived on Earth against how many fossils we have actually found and catalogued, and the ratio is almost incomprehensibly small. The overwhelming majority of every species that has ever existed, including extremely common, widespread species that lived for millions of years, left no fossil record we have ever found, and likely none that survived at all. This is also the honest, evidence-based explanation for something that does get genuinely mischaracterized online, the so-called gaps in the fossil record, most famously the Cambrian explosion, the period roughly 538 million years ago, when complex, hard-shelled animal life appears to diversify rapidly in the fossil record, after a long preceding span dominated by simpler, mostly soft-bodied organisms. This sometimes gets presented as an unexplained mystery, a sudden switch flipping with no preceding evolutionary build-up, occasionally framed online as evidence of some kind of external intervention. The actual paleontological explanation is more interesting and entirely sufficient on its own. Soft-bodied organisms, the kind that almost certainly existed in complex and diversifying forms well before the Cambrian, simply do not fossilize well under ordinary conditions, lacking the hard shells, bones, or other mineralized structures that make fossilization dramatically more likely. The Cambrian explosion corresponds closely with the evolutionary innovation of hard, mineralized body parts, shells, exoskeletons, the kinds of structures that suddenly start leaving a much richer, much more visible fossil record, not necessarily a sudden, unprecedented burst of evolutionary complexity appearing from nowhere. Rare sites with exceptional preservation conditions, including the Ediacaran fossil beds that predate the Cambrian by tens of millions of years, do show evidence of complex, diverse, soft-bodied life already developing before the apparent explosion, supporting exactly this preservation bias explanation rather than a genuine evolutionary discontinuity. The gap is real. The interpretation of it as evidence of something other than ordinary preservation bias is not supported by the broader fossil evidence we do have from the rare sites where conditions happen to favor it. Apply this same logic, the logic of what survives versus what actually happened, to the specific question of an industrial civilization, and the numbers become genuinely sobering in a way that should make you reconsider how confident you can be in either direction of this debate. Human industrial civilization, as a globally significant, atmosphere-altering, planet-reshaping force, is perhaps 2 centuries old, depending on exactly where you draw the starting line. If a comparable civilization existed, reached a similar level of technological development, and then collapsed or otherwise ended, all within a similarly brief window, somewhere in the tens of thousands of years range at the absolute outside, occurring at some point in the many tens of millions of years before modern humans evolved, the mathematics of preservation we just walked through suggest the physical, structural evidence, buildings, tools, direct artifacts, would have an extraordinarily low probability of surviving in any recognizable form. Buildings erode, metal corrodes to nothing on exactly the kind of timescale we are discussing. Even the deepest mines and quarries eventually fill in, erode, or are buried so completely that distinguishing them from natural cave systems and geological fracturing becomes essentially impossible without a level of direct excavation nobody has any specific reason to undertake at any specific location. What would theoretically survive, based on the Anthropocene marker logic Schmidt and Frank's paper builds its whole argument around, is exactly the category of evidence we have spent this video walking through and testing against real data. Chemical and isotopic signatures, distributed globally, synchronized in time, and large enough in magnitude to be distinguishable from the kind of natural background variation that volcanism, methane release, and other ordinary geological processes already produce. And this is where the honest answer to, could we even tell, becomes genuinely nuanced, rather than a simple yes or no. We could, in principle, detect a signature like that, if it exists, using exactly the techniques that found the iridium layer in Italy, exactly the techniques that dated the Oklo reactor, exactly the techniques currently being used to characterize the Younger Dryas boundary layer. Those techniques are real, established, and routinely applied to drilled sediment cores and exposed rock sequences all over the world for entirely unrelated scientific purposes. But detecting a signature requires first having a sample from the right time and place, and Earth's deep past is so vast, so unevenly preserved, and so incompletely sampled, that the honest scientific position is not we have searched everywhere and found nothing. It is closer to we have sampled an enormous number of locations and time periods for other scientific reasons. We have never found a signature consistent with an ancient industrial civilization in any of that incidental sampling, and the total area and time span we have actually examined in fine enough detail to rule out a signature with confidence remains a genuinely small fraction of everything that exists. That is the real, complete, scientifically honest answer, and it is more interesting than either of the answers that tend to circulate online. It is not we have proof. It is also not entirely impossible. Case closed. It is a structurally open question, with a clearly defined methodology for how it could be answered if the right evidence ever turned up, an enormous amount of incidental sampling that has so far turned up nothing supporting the idea, and a final, honest acknowledgement that incidental sampling, however extensive, is not the same as a deliberate, exhaustive search, which has never actually been conducted, and, given the sheer scale of the planet's geological record, may genuinely never be entirely conductible. This is also, by the way, exactly why Schmidt and Frank wrote their paper in the first place, and it points toward the single most useful, practical reason this entire thought experiment matters, separate from any question of whether a prior civilization actually existed. It turns the question back around on us, on the civilization currently doing the asking, in a way that has real, immediate, measurable consequences for how the geological record will read 66 million years from now. Part 8. The real lesson, sitting in a Greek museum. Before we turn the question back on ourselves, it is worth pausing on one more piece of evidence, not because it has anything to do with civilizations vanishing into deep time, but because it is the single best real example of the underlying instinct driving this entire topic, our deep, recurring suspicion that the past holds more than we have given it credit for, actually being proven correct. In 1901, a team of Greek sponge divers working off the small island of Antikythera, in the waters between Crete and the Greek mainland, recovered the wreck of an ancient cargo ship, along with a corroded, unremarkable-looking lump of bronze. For decades, that lump sat in storage, eventually cracking apart to reveal a complex arrangement of gear wheels inside, far too intricate to immediately make sense of, and was largely set aside as a curiosity nobody could fully explain. It took most of the 20th century, and eventually the application of high-resolution X-ray imaging and CT scanning technology, for researchers to finally reconstruct what they were actually looking at: a geared analog computer, dated to somewhere between roughly 150 and 100 BC, containing at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, originally housed in a wooden case roughly the size of a large book, designed to track and predict the positions of the sun and moon, the phases of the moon, and quite possibly the positions of the 5 planets known to ancient astronomers, along with the timing of eclipses and the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. The level of mechanical sophistication packed into the Antikythera mechanism genuinely startled historians of science and engineering when its full function was finally understood, because nothing else of comparable complexity was known to exist anywhere in the historical record for well over 1,000 years afterward. Gearing of this precision, with differential gear trains capable of modeling the genuinely complicated, non-uniform motion of the moon against the night sky, simply was not believed to exist in the ancient Mediterranean world until this single object proved otherwise. Historians now generally connect it to a tradition of Greek mechanical and astronomical engineering associated with figures like Archimedes and the astronomer Hipparchus, a tradition we know existed through ancient written references to similar devices, but for which the Antikythera mechanism remains the only confirmed physical survivor. Here is why this object matters so directly to tonight's entire video, and it deserves to be stated as plainly as possible. The Antikythera mechanism is genuine, confirmed, scientifically verified proof that an ancient civilization, well within the time frame of conventional written human history, possessed a level of precision engineering that modern historians, before 1901, simply did not believe was possible for that era. It is real evidence that our assumptions about the technological ceiling of the deep past can be, and demonstrably have been, wrong. And it is precisely the kind of evidence the entire Silurian hypothesis conversation is hungry for: a genuine, physical, undeniable artifact that overturns a confident assumption about what the past was capable of. But notice everything about how this evidence actually arrived, because the contrast with everything we have debunked so far in this video is the entire point. The Antikythera mechanism is a single, physical, recoverable object made of corrosion-resistant bronze, lost in a shipwreck, and therefore preserved in a stable, low-oxygen underwater environment rather than exposed to surface weathering, recovered through a documented, verifiable expedition, dated through multiple independent lines of archaeological and stylistic evidence, to a specific, narrow historical window fully within the range of written human history, where we have independent textual evidence, actual ancient Greek and Roman writers describing similar devices, that corroborates rather than contradicts its existence. Every single one of those factors, durable material, stable preservation environment, secure documented recovery, precise independent dating, corroborating evidence from other sources, is exactly what was missing from the Klerksdorp spheres, the London Hammer, and the unverified Antarctic radar claims we walked through earlier in this video. This is not a coincidence, and it is the most important comparison we can draw before closing tonight's video. Real, surprising evidence that overturns assumptions about the deep past does exist, and the Antikythera mechanism proves the past is genuinely capable of springing surprises on confident historians. But real evidence, when it actually exists, comes packaged with exactly the kind of corroborating detail, secure dating, physical recoverability, independent confirmation, that all of the lost civilization claims examined earlier in this video conspicuously lack. The instinct that makes people want to believe in a vanished, advanced, pre-human civilization is not an irrational instinct. It is the same instinct that turns out to be exactly correct about Antikythera. What separates a real historical surprise from a manufactured one is not the size of the claim. It is whether the evidence behind it can survive the same kind of careful, patient, isotope-by-isotope scrutiny that solved the Oklo reactor and dated the Antikythera gears, rather than the kind of scrutiny that dissolves the Klerksdorp spheres back into ordinary mineral concretions the moment someone actually cuts one open. So now we have a genuinely complete, honest picture. Real ancient surprises exist, and the methodology for verifying them is well understood and has already produced confirmed results. The question that remains, the one this video has been building toward since the very first sentence about that iridium layer in Italy, is what our own civilization is doing with that exact methodology right now, in real time, on rock layers that have not finished forming yet, and what a future Antikythera-style discovery of our own civilization might eventually look like to whoever, or whatever, finds it. Part 9. What we are already writing into the rock. Here is where this entire question stops being about the deep past and becomes something far more immediate, because while scientists have spent the last several decades debating whether to look for evidence of a prior industrial civilization, an entirely separate group of geologists has spent that same period seriously debating whether to formally name the epoch our own civilization is currently creating, using exactly the kind of evidence Schmidt and Frank's paper describes as the theoretical signature any industrial civilization would leave behind. This proposed epoch is called the Anthropocene, broadly meaning the age of humans, and the scientific case for it is, by this point in tonight's video, going to sound immediately familiar. Researchers studying the question have pointed to several specific, measurable markers as candidates for defining its start, each one a real, physical signature already being deposited into sediment, ice, and rock around the world right now. The clearest and most precisely datable of these is the global fallout from above-ground nuclear weapons testing, conducted primarily in the 1950s and early 1960s, which scattered a thin, sharp, globally synchronized layer of radioactive isotopes, plutonium-239 prominently among them, into soil, ice, and ocean sediment across the entire planet, within the span of just a few years. This layer is already detectable in ice cores, lake sediments, and coral growth bands worldwide, dated precisely enough that an international working group of geologists formally proposed using it as the official boundary marker, the so-called golden spike, defining the start of the Anthropocene epoch. Alongside the plutonium signature sit several other candidate markers, each one independently corroborating the same general time window, a sharp, measurable increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane, visible directly in ice core bubbles, and distinguishable through exactly the carbon isotope analysis we discussed back when we covered the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a global scattering of microplastic particles now found in sediment cores from the deepest ocean trenches to the most remote polar ice, made from synthetic polymer compounds that, before the mid-20th century, simply did not exist anywhere on this planet, an immeasurable spike in fly ash and other industrial combustion byproducts, along with a sharp documented shift in biodiversity, the kind of extinction rate signature that, as we discussed earlier in this video, normally only shows up in the geological record in association with asteroid impacts or massive volcanic episodes. Geologists studying this exact accumulation of evidence have given it a specific, formal vocabulary worth knowing. The British stratigrapher Jan Zalasiewicz coined the term technofossil to describe exactly this category of object, anything manufactured by humans, from a discarded bottle cap to an entire city's worth of concrete foundations, that has a real, if uncertain chance of being preserved into the deep geological future the same way a seashell or a dinosaur bone is preserved today, and the specific mid-20th century timing shared by nearly every one of these markers, the nuclear fallout, the sharpest upturn in carbon emissions, the explosion in global plastic production, has its own name in the scientific literature as well, the Great Acceleration, a term describing the sudden, synchronized worldwide surge across dozens of independent measures of human activity, energy use, population, fertilizer production, urban growth, that all begin curving sharply upward at almost exactly the same point on the timeline, right around 1950, regardless of which specific marker you happen to be measuring. In March of 2024, the relevant body within the International Union of Geological Sciences, the organization responsible for formally defining and naming geological time periods, voted on whether to officially ratify the Anthropocene as a new geological epoch, beginning specifically around 1950, anchored to that nuclear fallout signature. The proposal was rejected, not because the underlying evidence of human-caused planetary change was disputed. Every geologist involved in that vote agrees humanity has altered the planet's chemistry in a measurable, lasting way, but over more technical disagreements about formal naming conventions, the appropriate scale and starting point for a unit this geologically brief compared to the standard length of other named epochs, and procedural questions about how the vote itself was conducted, several aspects of which remain under active dispute within the geological community as this video is being made. The scientific argument over the name and the formal boundaries continues. The underlying fact the argument is about, that human civilization has already created a permanent, detectable, globally synchronized signature in Earth's emerging rock record, comparable in basic structure to the kind of signature this entire video has spent its time discussing, is not seriously contested by anyone involved. This is, genuinely, the single most useful and most immediately verifiable conclusion available anywhere in this entire topic, and it deserves to land with real weight. We do not need to speculate, theorize, or search for ambiguous anomalies in ancient rock to answer the core question Schmidt and Frank's paper actually posed. We already know, with confidence, exactly what an industrial civilization's geological signature looks like, because we are generating one in real time, right now, and scientists are already measuring it using precisely the same techniques, isotope ratios, sediment cores, synchronized global timing, that would be used to identify a similar signature from millions of years in the past, if one is ever found. Future geologists, whoever or whatever they turn out to be, 66 million years from now, examining a rock layer corresponding to roughly the 20th and 21st centuries, would very likely find exactly the kind of evidence this entire video has spent its time searching for in the deep past. A thin, sharp, globally synchronized spike in radioactive isotopes that occur nowhere in nature. A carbon signature consistent with a sudden, massive release of ancient buried carbon. A layer of synthetic polymer particles unlike anything the planet had ever produced before, and a measurable discontinuity in fossil diversity. They would, almost certainly, conclude that something happened. Whether they would correctly conclude what that something was, an industrial civilization rather than some exotic natural process, is exactly the same open methodological question we have spent this entire video applying to every claimed signature from the deep past, just pointed, this time, directly at ourselves. Part 10. Why this question will not let go of us. Before we close, it is worth asking honestly why this particular question, did someone come before us, has so much pull. Why two videos covering essentially the same topic can pull in well over 2 million combined views. Why this entire genre of content keeps finding an audience year after year, decade after decade, going back long before YouTube existed, all the way through Atlantis legends that are themselves over 2,000 years old. Understanding that pull honestly is not a distraction from the science. It is part of giving this topic the complete, respectful treatment it deserves, rather than either mocking the impulse or exploiting it. Part of the appeal is genuinely intellectual, and we hope tonight's video has demonstrated that clearly. The actual Silurian hypothesis, the real Schmidt and Frank paper, the real Oklo reactor, the real, ongoing Younger Dryas debate, are all legitimately fascinating on their own terms, without needing a single invented detail. Good science is full of exactly this kind of question. Ambitious, a little unsettling, genuinely difficult to answer with full confidence, and entirely worth taking seriously, even when the honest answer turns out to be, we are not sure yet, rather than a clean, satisfying resolution. But there is also something deeper at work, something worth naming plainly rather than dancing around. There is real comfort and real humility in the idea that we might not be the only ones to have ever stood where we are standing now, looking up at the same stars, wondering about the same questions, building things meant to outlast us, and eventually, like everything else, fading. If a prior civilization existed and vanished, leaving behind nothing but a thin chemical trace some future geologist might one day puzzle over, that is, in its own strange way, a less lonely thought than being the only ones who will ever ask these questions at all. It also functions as a kind of mirror, a way of thinking honestly about our own civilization's fragility and permanence, by imagining ourselves from the outside, from 66 million years in the future, looking back at our own rock layer the way we look back at the dinosaurs. That is a genuinely valuable exercise in perspective, regardless of whether a prior civilization ever actually existed, and it is, in fact, exactly the exercise Schmidt and Frank's paper is built around. The honest, complete answer to tonight's question, the one this entire video has been assembling piece by piece, looks like this. There is no confirmed scientific evidence that an industrial civilization existed on Earth before humans. Every specific artifact and anomaly commonly cited as such evidence, when examined with the same rigor that solved the Oklo reactor mystery, has a well-supported natural or historical explanation, concretions, misdated objects, undocumented folklore, or natural glacial landforms. At the same time, the methodological question Schmidt and Frank actually posed, would we even be able to detect such a civilization if it had existed, deserves a careful, nuanced answer rather than a dismissive one. We know exactly what kind of evidence to look for, because we are generating that exact kind of evidence right now, in the Anthropocene signature currently being written into the planet's emerging rock record. We have sampled an enormous amount of Earth's deep past, for entirely unrelated scientific reasons, and never once found a comparable signature. And we also have to be honest that an enormous amount of Earth's deep past has never been sampled at all, that the planet is extraordinarily good at erasing evidence over millions of years, and that absence of evidence, while it is real and meaningful evidence in its own right, is not the same thing as proof of absence. That is not a thrilling, tidy conclusion, and we are not going to pretend it is one just to give this video a more dramatic ending than the actual science supports. It is, however, the honest one, and we think the honest version of this story, the real Oklo reactor, the real Antikythera mechanism, the real and genuinely contested Younger Dryas debate, is considerably more interesting than the invented one, because every piece of it is something you can actually go verify yourself, in published, peer-reviewed sources, rather than something you simply have to take a narrator's word for. Part 11. How to evaluate the next one. Because there will be a next one. This particular topic resurfaces constantly. A new viral photo, a new claimed anomaly, a new documentary making bigger promises than the last one, and having walked through the real cases tonight, Oklo, the Klerksdorp spheres, the London Hammer, the Antarctic Pyramid, the Younger Dryas debate, the Antikythera mechanism, you now actually have a working set of questions you can apply yourself, the same basic questions that separated the real discoveries from the manufactured ones, in everything we just covered. First, ask whether the claim has been published anywhere a working scientist could actually check it, examine the methodology, and attempt to replicate it, the way the Oklo findings, the Younger Dryas impact papers, and the Antikythera mechanism's mechanical reconstruction were all published in venues other researchers could scrutinize directly. A claim that exists only as a video narration, a blog post, or a social media thread, with no underlying paper anyone in the relevant field has reviewed, has not yet cleared the most basic bar that every single piece of real evidence in tonight's video cleared. Second, ask whether the object or signature in question can actually still be examined directly by someone other than the person who originally found it, the way the Klerksdorp spheres can be, and have been, cut open and analyzed by independent geologists, or the way ice cores documenting the Anthropocene's plutonium signature sit in climate research archives available to any qualified researcher who wants to verify the measurement. A huge share of the most dramatic claims in this genre, the coal artifacts especially, fail this test immediately, because the original object is unavailable, lost, or was never properly documented in the first place, leaving nothing for anyone to actually check. Third, ask whether the dating behind the claim comes from an independent, established method, radiometric dating, stratigraphic context, isotope analysis, or whether it rests entirely on the word of whoever is telling the story. The London Hammer's supposed Ordovician age and the Piri race map's supposed depiction of an ice-free Antarctica both fail this test specifically, resting on assertions about age and origin that no independent dating method has ever actually confirmed. Fourth, and this is the one that matters most, ask whether the explanation requires only the evidence in front of you, or whether it requires you to also assume an entire invisible infrastructure, an entire unmentioned civilization, an entire unverified chain of events, none of which has any independent supporting evidence of its own. The real Younger Dryas impact hypothesis requires assuming an extraterrestrial impact, a claim genuinely supported by the platinum and spheral evidence sitting in the actual sediment. The leap to an advanced lost global civilization, wiped out by that impact, requires assuming an entire society, with cities, writing, and technology that has left no archaeological trace anywhere on Earth, despite extensive, well-funded excavation across exactly the regions and time periods where it is claimed to have existed. The first claim rests on physical evidence you can hold in your hand. The second rests on the absence of physical evidence being reinterpreted as proof of how thoroughly that evidence must have been erased, which is exactly the kind of reasoning that can be used to support absolutely any claim, no matter how unlikely, since it treats the total lack of supporting evidence as if it were itself a kind of evidence. And fifth, simply ask what happens to the story if you remove every adjective doing emotional work, impossible, undeniable, unmistakable, shocking, and replace them with the plain, measured language an actual peer-reviewed geology paper would use. Read back through tonight's video and notice how often that exercise alone, just stripping out the dramatic framing language, was enough to reveal which claims were resting on real data and which were resting almost entirely on the framing itself. The Oklo reactor sounds almost more remarkable once you strip the drama away and simply state, plainly, that nature spontaneously assembled a self-regulating nuclear fission reactor underground for several 100,000 years with no intelligence involved whatsoever. The Klerksdorp spheres sound considerably less remarkable once you replace perfectly machined metal balls with the more accurate, naturally formed wollastonite and hematite concretions. The language a claim is wrapped in is often doing far more persuasive work than the underlying evidence, and that single observation, more than any specific fact in this video, is the tool most worth carrying with you the next time one of these stories crosses your feed. Part 12. If we vanish tomorrow. There is one more thought experiment worth walking through carefully, because it ties everything in tonight's video together, and it is built entirely on real, well-documented science about decay rates, corrosion, and ecological succession, not speculation. If every human being on Earth disappeared tomorrow, no catastrophe, no explanation, simply gone, what would actually happen to everything we built, and how long would any of it last? In the first days, almost nothing changes. Lights stay on as long as power plants keep running on automated systems and existing fuel reserves. Within roughly a week, most fossil fuel power plants begin shutting down as fuel supply chains, which depend on continuous human operation, break down. Nuclear plants, designed with multiple layers of automatic safety shutdown, specifically for scenarios like operator absence, would mostly power down safely on their own, a genuinely reassuring piece of real engineering most people never think about. Within weeks, without pumps running, subway systems and underground infrastructure in coastal and low-lying cities begin flooding. Within a year, untended swimming pools turn into pond ecosystems, complete with insects, amphibians, and the first colonizing plants. Roads start cracking as freeze-thaw cycles, unaddressed by any maintenance crew, work into every seam and pothole. Within a decade, the structural picture changes considerably. Wood frame houses, lacking roof maintenance, begin leaking, rotting, and collapsing. Steel structures begin rusting visibly, and rust, unlike many forms of corrosion, is self-perpetuating in the presence of moisture and oxygen, meaning it accelerates rather than slows as it progresses. Concrete, popularly assumed to be nearly permanent, is genuinely vulnerable over these timescales, specifically because of the steel reinforcing bars embedded inside it. As those bars rust, they expand, and that expansion physically cracks the surrounding concrete from the inside out, a process structural engineers call spalling, which is already a maintenance concern in modern bridges and parking structures, even with regular human upkeep. Within a few decades, many modern buildings, lacking that upkeep entirely, would be structurally compromised. Within a century or two, most major cities would be substantially reclaimed by vegetation, with the most visible exception being structures built from naturally weather-resistant stone, the same category of material, worth noting, that has allowed genuinely ancient stone monuments, the pyramids, Stonehenge, the Parthenon, to survive thousands of years of human history relatively intact, while the wood and mud brick structures built alongside them in the same eras vanished almost completely, a real, observable preview of exactly the differential preservation problem this entire video has been built around. Within 1,000 years, the vast majority of human construction would be gone or unrecognizable, with the partial exception of certain stone monuments, the deepest mining infrastructure, and a small number of structures specifically engineered for extreme long-term stability, including, genuinely, modern deep geological nuclear waste repositories, which by design and by international regulatory requirement are intended to remain physically isolated for periods stretching into the tens of thousands of years, making them, by a strange and very real irony, among the most deliberately durable structures our entire civilization is currently building. Satellites in orbit would follow their own separate decay timeline, entirely disconnected from anything happening on the ground. Those in low Earth orbit, within a few hundred miles of the surface, experience enough atmospheric drag that, without occasional engine boosts to maintain altitude, a maintenance task currently performed routinely and continuously by ground controllers, they would gradually lose altitude and burn up on re-entry within years to a few decades, depending on their specific orbit. Satellites in much higher geostationary orbits, the kind used for television broadcast and some communications, experience negligible drag and could remain in orbit, slowly tumbling and degrading from solar radiation for millions of years, making them, quite possibly, the single longest-lasting physical artifacts our civilization will ever produce. A genuinely strange thought to sit with. Our most durable legacy may turn out to be objects we have intentionally placed in space, specifically so they would never come back. Plastic follows yet another timeline entirely, and it deserves special attention because it connects most directly back to the Anthropocene discussion from earlier in this video. Exposed to sunlight and oxygen on a beach or in a landfill, many common plastics break down into smaller fragments within years to decades, though true full chemical breakdown into harmless base components can take centuries longer. Buried deep in low-oxygen ocean sediment, away from sunlight and most biological activity, the same plastic could persist in recognizable fragment form for a genuinely long time, plausibly stretching into the same tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years range that defines how long the radioactive isotopes from 20th century nuclear testing remain detectable, which is precisely why microplastic particles already sit, alongside that nuclear signature, on the short, serious, real list of candidate markers geologists have proposed for defining the start of the Anthropocene epoch. What this entire exercise actually demonstrates, stripped of any speculative or invented detail, is something genuinely sobering, and it is the clearest, most honest illustration available of why this whole topic is so difficult to resolve either way. Almost everything that currently feels permanent about human civilization, our buildings, our roads, our machines, the physical infrastructure that makes up the overwhelming majority of what a casual visitor would point to as evidence we exist, would be gone or unrecognizable within a span of time that is genuinely brief by geological standards, a few thousand years, at the absolute outside, for the vast majority of it. What would actually remain detectable on a timescale of tens of millions of years? The kind of timescale this entire video has been asking you to hold in your head since the very first sentence about that iridium layer in Italy is almost none of the things we instinctively think of as our legacy, and almost entirely the chemical and isotopic signatures we have spent this video learning to recognize: the nuclear fallout layer, the carbon isotope shift, the plastic particles buried in stable sediment, the sharp discontinuity in fossil diversity. If that is true for us, with our satellites and our deep geological repositories and our extraordinarily well-documented, globally synchronized industrial activity, the most thoroughly recorded civilization that has ever existed on this planet, then it is, at minimum, a reasonable and intellectually honest thing to wonder what an equivalent civilization from tens of millions of years ago, with none of our documentation, none of our satellites, possibly working with entirely different materials and technologies we cannot even anticipate, would have left behind for us to find. The honest answer, again, is we do not currently have evidence that one existed. The equally honest second half of that answer is that the kind of evidence we would need is narrow, specific, chemically subtle, and the planet has had an extraordinarily long time and an extraordinarily effective set of geological processes available to make sure we would have to look very precisely in exactly the right place to ever find it. Closing. What to carry away from this? So here is everything tonight's video actually adds up to, and here is what we think is worth carrying away from it. A NASA climate scientist and an astrophysicist asked, seriously and in a peer-reviewed paper, whether we could detect an industrial civilization in Earth's geological record if one had existed millions of years before us. The honest answer is genuinely nuanced. We know exactly what to look for, because we are creating that exact signature ourselves, right now, in the nuclear fallout layer, the carbon isotope shift, and the plastic particles already settling into sediment around the planet. We have sampled an enormous amount of Earth's deep past, for entirely unrelated scientific reasons, and never once found a comparable signature from before our own civilization existed. And we have to be honest that the planet is extraordinarily good at erasing evidence that almost everything we currently consider permanent about our own civilization would be unrecognizable within a few thousand years, and that the total amount of deep time we have actually examined closely enough to be confident in a negative result remains a genuinely small fraction of everything that exists to be examined. Every specific anomaly people point to as evidence, the Klerksdorp spheres, the London hammer, the structures supposedly buried under Antarctic ice, dissolves the moment someone applies the same careful, independently verifiable methodology that solved the real, genuinely strange case of the Oklo natural reactor, 2 billion years old, entirely natural, no intelligence required. The one piece of this conversation that involves a real, ongoing, legitimate scientific argument, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, is real specifically because it has actual published, peer-reviewed, contested evidence behind it, and it gets misused, specifically when that legitimate uncertainty is borrowed to manufacture false credibility for an entirely separate claim, an advanced lost global civilization that has essentially no supporting archaeological evidence at all. And the Antikythera mechanism proves, conclusively and without any need for speculation, that the deep past genuinely can surprise confident historians, provided the evidence survives in a form and a location that lets it actually be checked. Here is what we want you to actually do with all of that. The next time a video, an article, or a social media post claims to have found definitive proof of an ancient lost civilization, run it through the 5 questions from part 11 before you accept it or share it further. Has this been published somewhere a scientist could actually check it? Can the object or signature still be examined independently by someone other than whoever found it? Does the dating come from an established independent method, or just from the storyteller's assertion? Does the explanation require only what is in front of you, or does it require assuming an entire invisible, unevidenced civilization to make sense? And what happens to the claim once you strip out every dramatic adjective and restate it in plain, careful language? That 5-question filter will not make the topic any less fascinating. It will make you considerably harder to fool, and it will let you enjoy the genuinely strange, genuinely true parts of this story, Oklo, Antikythera, the real Younger Dryas debate, without having to also carry around a head full of claims that fall apart under the first careful look. If tonight's video is the kind of thing you want more of, careful, honest, genuinely well-researched science, applied to the questions that usually get the sloppiest treatment online, that is exactly what subscribing to Sky Ruins gets you. We are not interested in telling you a comfortable lie just because it performs well, and we are not interested in dismissing a genuinely fascinating question just because parts of its online fandom have gotten carried away with it. We want to be the channel that takes you all the way through both the real Oklo reactor and the fake Antarctic pyramid in the same video, with the same rigor applied to each, and tells you honestly which one is which. Drop a comment and tell us this. If you could choose exactly one place on Earth to drill a single, perfect sediment core, anywhere, any depth, any time, in the planet's 4.5 billion year history, where would you put it, and what do you think, or hope, it would find? We are genuinely curious what this audience picks, because the honest answer is that nobody, including the scientists who wrote the actual papers this video is built on, has ever had the chance to take that one perfect sample from everywhere at once, and the place you choose says something real about which part of this mystery pulls at you the hardest. And if you know somebody who has ever sent you one of those breathless videos about ancient nuclear reactors or pyramids under the ice, somebody who would genuinely enjoy knowing the real story behind the Oklo reactor or the real reason that Antarctic Peak is shaped like a pyramid, share this video with them specifically. Not because we need the numbers, though we will not pretend we mind them, but because this is exactly the kind of story that deserves to spread in its true form rather than its exaggerated one, and you sharing the honest version is the single most effective correction that exists for the inflated version already sitting in their feed. We will leave you with the same image we opened with, because it deserves one more look now that you have the full context behind it. A thin, dark band of clay in a hillside in Italy, a centimetre of rock separating one geological age from the next, holding inside it the precise chemical fingerprint of an asteroid that struck this planet 66 million years ago. Somewhere, right now, in an ocean basin, or a polar ice sheet, or a riverbed nobody has drilled yet, there may be another band exactly like it, or there may not be. Either way, the same careful methods that found the first one are still being used in active research programs on every continent, every single year. If something else is down there, the real scientific process, not a documentary narrator, not a viral photograph, is the thing that will eventually find it, exactly the way it found Oklo, exactly the way it dated Antikythera. That is not a disappointing place to leave this question. It is, honestly, the most exciting place there is to leave it, because it means the next real discovery in this story has not happened yet, and when it does, it will be verifiable, repeatable, and true. We will be back with the next piece of this kind of question soon. Until then, look closely, ask for the evidence behind the claim, and we will see you in the next one.